Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan guru-murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is the Conservative MP for Harlow. Robert Halfon has been in Parliament for over 10 years, but he's had a relatively short-lived ministerial career. He has many passions, including the state of Israel, because he comes from a Jewish family, and he is a man who speaks up for working class Conservatives, people from ordinary backgrounds. He has even suggested that the Conservative Party change its name at one point to the Workers' Party, and he has warned in the past that it was facing oblivion if it didn't change its focus. He was also born with a type of cerebral palsy, and so he is disabled. And so for many months last year, he was shielding and at home. And he has spoken about the difficulties in Parliament of being disabled and how appallingly adapted those buildings are. So thank you very much indeed for joining us, Robert.
Good morning.
Your big job at the moment, of course, is as chairman of the Education Select Committee. And right now we are in lockdown. Schools are working from home. I've got a 13-year-old in the room next door and a 15-year-old upstairs trying to do online school and staring at computers, sort of slightly flummoxed half the time. It is a really terrible time, isn't it, for education and for the gaps between rich and poor.
Yeah, I think it is a national disaster. My huge worry is that long after the coronavirus has gone, our nation faces an epidemic of educational poverty, a mental health crisis and safeguarding crises, because we know that during the lockdown, loss of attainment, loss of learning has been huge, particularly amongst disadvantaged pupils. We know that mental health is on the increase. The Royal Society of Paediatricians said only a week or so ago that eating disorders amongst young people had gone up by fourfold because of social isolation, schools being closed. So potentially this is going to be very, very difficult in the long run.
I mean, I know every area affected by coronavirus is able to say, well, this is unplanned, unforeseen. We could never have imagined we'd be in this place. But when it comes to education, it really doesn't feel like we've handled it very well.
I think that the problem is that all the resources of the state were focused on the economy and on health. And you kind of understand that because the government are trying to avoid destitution on the one side and death and ill health on the other. But to me, I'm passionate about education, and I think education has to be the third part of that triangle. And the vision that we saw for health and the economy, whether it's the furlough scheme, the Nightingale hospitals, that just hasn't happened. Why haven't there been Nightingale or Alan Turing schools set up around the country? Why did it take so long for the catch-up fund to be decided upon? Why have remote learning, we know, despite the individual efforts of many teachers and many schools, has been pretty patchy. And during the last lockdown, something like 2.3 million children with barely any learning at all. And for some reason, education's always been on the back burner, and that has to change because, as I say, I think we are creating deep-rooted problems, and we don't want to come out of this with the attainment levels between the disadvantaged pupils and better off pupils being even worse.
I mean, there will be, won't they?
Oh, sadly, there will be. And even without the coronavirus, by the time you get to GCSEs, disadvantaged pupils are 18 months behind their better off peers. So, and all we've done is accelerate that. The Institute for Fiscal Studies published a report a few days ago just saying that the attainment gap was going to get worse, and all the problems we have already existing in education are going to be magnified.
Why is education such a passion of yours?
Because I've always seen it as a ladder of opportunity. I mean, even you have problems at home, troubled families. The school now is not just a place of learning. It's in essence a community hub. It gives the children nutrition. It gives the children learning. It gives the children social networks and friendships. It gives the children mental health counselling. And even if they do come from troubled families, that school is a place of stability. And I've seen the same with skills and apprenticeships. My first ever speech in the House of Commons was about apprenticeships because as a parliamentary candidate, even before I became an MP, met young people in a pretty grim building with a charity called Catch 22 who desperate to get skills and jobs, and they wanted to do apprenticeships, but there were so many obstacles in their way. And I genuinely left that building even before I'd been elected to Parliament, saying that if I become an MP, I'm going to make it my business to talk about apprenticeships, skills, and education.
So it's been watching other people's experience, because I'm guessing it's not come from your own experience, because you had a relatively comfortable childhood.
No, I was very lucky. My father came here as an immigrant with nothing. They were Jewish. My mother is from here, but third generation Jewish. Her family were originally from Eastern Europe, but generations ago. But my father came with nothing, but he had this view, education, education, education. And he wanted to send me to a private school, and I went to Highgate School. I'm very proud of it. Funnily enough, once somebody put on my Wikipedia page a picture of Highgate School Chapel, as if that was something I would be upset about. The irony was, of course, being Jewish, I never went into the chapel. The reason why I'm passionate about education skills is because of my experience in my constituency. I came to Harlow in late 1999. I started living here from 2000, and it changed my politics in many ways. It gave me an insight about how many people struggle in terms of the cost of living, but it also showed me the importance of education and skills.
So when you say your dad was an immigrant, where from? I mean, what's your ethnicity?
So my father originally came from Libya, but they were an interesting combination of Italian Jewish Libyans, and Gaddafi came, and he hated Jews, and he also hated Italians because the Italians had colonized Libya. I think my father once told me that he'd actually met Gaddafi because Gaddafi was the Cliff Richard of his time when he was younger. This was, of course, before he got to power. My grandfather said, who sold clothes, my late grandfather who sold clothes in Libya, sold them to the British Army. And he said that Britain was the greatest country in the world, partly because the British were the only people who paid on time. So there were pogroms against the Jews in Libya, even before Gaddafi took power, and he sent my father to England 15, but many of them went to Italy and some went to Israel.
So did that mean you grew up with the classic sort of immigrant, you're a bit of an outsider, you've got to be better than everybody else, education is absolutely central, you've got to make the best of what you've got kind of mentality?
Well, my father was, he would go through the reports, you'd go and sit with him. And if, he wasn't very happy, let's put it that way, if the school reports weren't great. But it was education and a work ethic. If you educate yourself, if you work hard, if you do the right thing, you will get on in life. And that was very much a sort of Thatcherite philosophy, and partly probably why I started to follow Mrs. Thatcher from a very, very young age and became a Conservative. One of the reasons is she spoke to families like us.
You had a picture of her not a picture, you had an autograph on your wall, didn't you?
Well, I first met her, yes. My father took me to a St. John's ambulance event because Mrs. Thatcher was going to be there. And I think I was 17 odd. And I got her to sign the ticket, which is currently framed in my downstairs toilet at home. But it was my first time I ever met her. I did hugely admire her. She had a massive impact on my life. And when she died, it was another huge moment. I mean, I got up very early. As an MP, I was able to go to St. Paul's Cathedral, but I got up about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning to go to St. Paul's Cathedral, just sit outside and take in the atmosphere at the time, because she had such influence on my political life.
I mean, it's unusual, isn't it, to sort of have a sort of teenage crush on Margaret Thatcher? But I mean,
it's very sad.
I mean, why do you think I mean, a lot of immigrant communities, traders and business people, actually gravitated towards the left, and Margaret Thatcher was not regarded widely as somebody who was particularly warm towards immigrant communities. Why were you a Conservative? Why did you gravitate towards her?
Because she was tough. She spoke about education and hard work. She stood up against the consensus. She was seen as a fighter. She was seen as someone who struggles. She'd achieved against the odds, woman prime minister. Okay, we take it for granted now, but in those days, it was a very much more chauvinist society. She came from pretty modest upbringing herself. She had a can-do attitude. She talked in a way that ordinary people could understand, particularly in the early days. You can't always explain these things. But I started listening to her and decided, yes, I just agreed with her and thought at the time, I thought she was just the right thing and great. And that's how I started getting involved in Conservative politics from a very young age. I mean, I think I joined the party in North London at about 14 years old.
And so was it an aspirational thing? I mean, that you felt you were aiming somewhere?
The irony is that I decided I would be an MP at the age of 10 years old before I even knew properly about Mrs. Thatcher, although I do remember reading a cartoon on the front page of the Daily Express on the floor of my house. I think it was the front page after she won the 1979 election, and it had Super Maggie on it. And I think it was based, I didn't obviously know at the time, but I think I was told since that it was based on a Macmillan cartoon, which had Super Mac. But an MP had come to my school saying the House of Commons had 1,000 rooms. I genuinely didn't believe it, and I demanded to go. And I went to the House of Commons, and I decided at 10 years old that I was going to be an MP.
So why did you want to be an MP?
First of all, because I thought having a job with a place that has 1,000 rooms would be a wonderful place to work. And I thought the building was incredible, and I still do. I never take it for granted. I mean, every day when I go in, even when you're waiting for a vote and you're sitting in members' lobby, let alone central lobby, I still look around and think how incredible this place really is. But later on, it was a number of things. One, it was because of Mrs. Thatcher, as I've mentioned, but also you mentioned that I had been born with cerebral palsy, so I had a lot of operations all the way through. But when I was originally very young, I couldn't walk, and the doctors had told my family that I would not be able to walk and do much with my life. And I saw the letters. And then my father took me to this amazing professor in Great Ormond Street Hospital, and he gave me some operations when I was 7. Obviously, medicine was very different in that time compared to what it is today. And I started having a series of operations, and that doctor subsequently passed me to another professor. And so I felt that actually being an MP is a form of public service. So it might not be what an NHS worker does or a teacher does, but you do actually serve your community.
Were you told when you were 7 that you probably wouldn't walk?
I didn't walk till very, very late compared to other children. And when I did walk, I started walking on tiptoe. So perhaps someone upstairs wanted me to be a ballet dancer in later life. I don't know. But actually, to this day, I find it very hard to watch ballet. I don't know. I don't, because it just reminds me of having to walk on tiptoes. So I find it painful to watch. But and I would fall down a lot. And doctors said that I probably wouldn't be able to do much with my life at the time.
What did they think your prognosis was going to be? I mean, what did they envisage your life as? In a wheelchair or?
I think in a wheelchair, yeah. And I don't know, because obviously I can't remember. And my father did show me the letters some time ago, but I then had operations and all through school and quite till late in life. And it's made a huge difference. Who'd have thought I'm an MP?
So what was school like? I mean, as somebody with cerebral palsy, I mean, were you treated well or badly, or both?
I was treated well. I've never been bullied. I went to a private school, prep school before Highgate School. I didn't particularly like it. I had a tough time. It was very strict, very, very traditional, and they had sort of mild corporal punishment. One time they thought I was going to be extremely clever because I was very good at reading and writing and literature, but I was rubbish at, I shouldn't really admit this as chair of the Education Select Committee, at numbers and mathematics and science. And so they soon realised that actually I wasn't some kind of clever clogs, although I loved history and English and literature, so I could do that really well.
And just to come back to sort of education now, I mean, you want to sort of quite radically change the education system, don't you? I mean, I've got a 15-year-old who's going through GCSEs at the moment, and I have to sort of keep biting myself before I say these exams are pointless. We don't need them.
So I think our education system is sort of stuck in sort of an old world that refuses to die and a new world that refuses to be born. So I'm not against exams. I think exams give structure and order. But what I don't understand is now that students, for the most part, stay at school till 18, why do we have GCSEs? And why do then we allow students to narrow at the age of 16 if they want to do A-level to 3 academic subjects? I was allowed to do history, English and politics A-level. Now, that should not have been allowed at 16 because I should have had to do a science or a vocational subject. So what I'd like to see is at least a debate on whether you scrap GCSEs. Now, it doesn't mean you wouldn't have some kind of testing at 16 or assessment so that schools know how kids are performing. But at 18, you'd have a national baccalaureate with vocational education, science, academic education, rather than narrowing. And I think that would make a huge difference rather than having this dividing line between academic and skills and apprenticeship that we have at the moment.
It does seem that education in this country has been very much at the whim of the Education Secretary, though. I mean, Michael Gove was able to sort of massively change things and sort of make things much more traditional and exam-based when he was Education Secretary, because that's what he thought. And Williamson, is very, again, isn't there far too much control in one person?
Well, just to be clear, I'm not against exams. I just think the timing of them and the nature of them, because you would have exams in vocational education and skills. So, and I hate this argument between progressives and traditionalists, because I think actually you need skills and you need knowledge, and you can't have one without the other. And there is this dividing line. You have to be a knowledge-based proponent of education or a skills-based proponent of education. I don't have a problem with education secretaries deciding what education policy is. I think that's what the responsibility of government. I mean, I do believe in autonomy, and for academies, I do believe in academies. I do believe in free schools as well. I think we should have more free schools in disadvantaged areas. But what I want is a long-term plan for education and skills. So the NHS, you have this 10-year plan for education. You have NHS England, a sort of strategic overview of what should happen to the health service over the next 10 years and, long-term funding settlements. Education doesn't get that, and policy changes regularly. There is no long-term plan. There's no equivalent of Education England. And I just think that there should be lots more. What are the aims of government for education in the long term? And once you decide what the end goal is, then you can work out what the things should be in between. And I think that the fourth industrial revolution is going to have a huge impact on us all. Dare I say, even news journalists as much as people in manual professions. Millions of jobs are going to be under threat. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to be lost, because if you retrain workers and reskill workers, you will be able to adapt to the fourth industrial revolution. But where is the thinking? Why the government, in my view, should set up a royal commission on the effects of the fourth industrial revolution on society and have the greatest scientists, social scientists, economists, academic people in the land sitting on that royal commission, not taking years to report, reporting over 9 months to a year, to examine the effects, what will happen, and to then provide a response about how education should respond.
And why are you calling it the fourth industrial revolution? And are we living it now, or is it something is still to properly arrive?
I think it's starting. I think 1 million jobs in McDonald's around the world will be done by robots. I went to a major bank in the city, and they told me that they had got rid of all their accountants, but not in terms of jobs. What they'd done is they retrained them into cybersecurity, because all the accountancy could be done by AI. And this is what I mean by this is fourth industrial revolution is going to affect almost every kind of profession. There are so many different statistics flying around in terms of job losses, and we need to get to the truth of it. And that's why I say we should have a royal commission. So it should look at the data as much as the impact. What is exactly going to happen, and how should we respond?
The short-termism that you're describing with education, I mean, isn't that generally the political disease? I mean, you mentioned the 10-year plan for the NHS, and we have a plan for climate change, but these are relatively new things, and it's not absolutely clear how they will really be taken forward in terms of concrete policy yet. Politics in general is very immediate, isn't it, and very short term.
Well, partly that is because of the nature of the way the media has changed. So, when I grew up, it was just you'd sit down at 6 o'clock and watch the BBC News, 6 p.m. Now, it's not even 24-hour news, it's 24-second news because it's the time it takes to write a tweet, a long tweet. So politicians are always now trying to respond to the media, which is ever pervasive and incessant. Social media has changed everything. So everyone is impatient for politicians to come up with ideas and news, and it does make long-term planning difficult. Having said all that, I think with leadership, you can set a direction and a narrative. And that's what, going back to Thatcher, whether you agreed with her or not, you knew her end goals, you knew all the things that she did fitted around that narrative philosophy. And there was a plan. And I think we need to go back to that kind of politics. Whether you agree with Mrs. Thatcher is a different issue. It's the way that you understood what she was about.
Your sort of long-term vision, if you like, recently was very much around this whole idea of who the Conservative Party is for and the Workers' Party. Now, in some people's minds, that was just addressed by getting Boris Johnson in because he could speak, he could reach the parts of the country that other people couldn't. Do you think it's turned out that way?
I think that if we look at the result we had last year was pretty remarkable because I thought that we would win, but I never imagined it would be with a majority of 80 and win seats like we did in certain parts of the country. But if we look at that incredible result, it was the first time we had a proper working majority, a serious majority since 1987. That is a long time. And the reason that it's taken that time to get that majority is because people, unfortunately, the Conservative Party for so long has been perceived as just being on the side of the well-off and not speaking for ordinary people in many ways. But Prime Minister's victory changed that in a way, but I do not underestimate how much of that victory partly was due to the Prime Minister's campaigning skills, but also because of Brexit. I don't feel there's some great love for our party, and there is still, from many, many ordinary people, and I'm not talking about politically motivated, that do Conservatives just favour the well-off. And when we had the problem with free school meals, for example, which fortunately now the government have adopted a policy that is good, but when we had the original vote, that played into people's perceptions.
Why do you think they got that so wrong? Is it just instinct is wrong?
Well, I think that they're always looking for trying to save taxpayers' money, and they thought that all the money that they'd given was enough. But I think it was just a lack of understanding of the struggles that people are under because of the coronavirus. And I've seen that in my own constituency. And the fact just a few weeks later they came up with hundreds of millions of pounds show that they'd recognised that a mistake had been made. But the issue is when things like that happen, it reminds people of the perception that has existed for so long of why they've been reluctant to give us a majority for such a long period of time. And the reason why I said I want us to be the Workers' Party is not just for the sake of a name change, it's because I felt that it would explain to people what we are about, which should be about cutting the cost of living, making our priority education and skills, particularly apprenticeships, and affordable housing. And I felt that given that our brand was tarnished, it would make a difference. And actually, to be fair, the Conservatives have done many things that do help workers, particularly in cutting taxes for lower pay, raising the threshold in which people have to pay tax, introducing the national living wage, which was a big step for the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party used to oppose the minimum wage, so it was a fundamental change.
But do you think this is something that actually comes naturally to Conservatives, or is it just about the electoral reality of trying to keep hold of those northern seats? Clearly you have thought about this deeply. Do you feel that your colleagues really believe this stuff?
Well, I think it came to Conservatives under Mrs. Thatcher, because she would never have got in without, there was saying Essex man, for example, white van man and woman. working hard, trying to earn a living. So I think that some Conservatives are focused on a smaller state in the free market and libertarianism. It's not where I am. I would have been more like that as a student, absolutely. But I'm more of what I call a workers' conservative, because I believe that
it's not about the battle between big and small government, it's about the battle between good and bad government.
Is this sort of slight rebelliousness perhaps the reason you have ended up not being in the ministerial sort of superhighway? I mean, you were a minister for a while, and you attended cabinet, but then you mysteriously lost the job. I mean, have you ever worked out why?
Well, I was very lucky. I sat in cabinet for a year, and that was a great moment as deputy chairman of the party. And then I was skills minister, which I loved doing. But these decisions are made, and I never understood why. But
really, I mean, it's not that you sort of were not in tune with the dominant thinking, or that you were causing trouble or anything like that.
I was never told why. The issue is that I was very lucky. I sat in cabinet for a year and a minister. So how many people can say that they have done that? Especially when I never, I didn't come from a political family and I became an MP. So I was very lucky, and then I got elected straight away. Which you have to be elected, as you know, to chair the select committee, all party, straight after losing that job. That has been one of the great jobs. I think I am very suited to it because I can say what I want. I can do an interview with you without having to get 6-week clearance from Downing Street press officers. I can campaign for things. I can influence ideas. And yes, I can do a lot of work on education.
But I mean, if you want to change the world, if you want to do things, you have to be a minister, don't you?
Well, you could argue that, because I love campaigning and I'd be able to change a lot of things as a campaigner. And so in our committee, and this isn't just me, by the way, it's all party. And that's the thing that I love about the committee, is that you can actually work with people from other parties. And the public don't see that because they all see us shouting at each other in the House of Commons. But we have been able to change the debate on special educational needs, on exclusions. It's you can influence policy, and so say things. If I can campaign things for things that should happen, that I believe should happen, sometimes if you use the media and public pressure, you can make a difference. And you can't do that if you're a minister, because you're subject to collective cabinet responsibility.
Do you think I mean, you mentioned the sort of being able to do an interview without getting clearance and all of that. I mean, it's become ridiculous, hasn't it? The levels of control and the picking and choosing of which programs you'll do and which programs you won't.
Oh, I felt it was ridiculous. I mean, when I was a minister, it had to be cleared. Even the most obscure things had to be cleared by Downing Street. I got married in 2016, and I was asked by, I think it was one of the education papers, to write about my honeymoon, and even that had to get cleared.
And who clears it? I mean, when you say cleared by Downing Street, is it some sort of spotty 25-year-old deciding what you do?
No idea. But all these things had to be checked off, and that's what drove me mad, because I don't like bureaucracy. I just don't have the patience for it. I understand why it has to happen, because in some ways, if suddenly a minister puts out a statement in the paper when there's another minister doing a big announcement on prison education, and another minister puts out an announcement on housing, it does confuse the situation. So I understand why there has to be a grid and all this sort of thing. But there are upsides and downsides. All I'm saying is there are upsides and downsides to being a minister and not being a minister. And if you're chair of a committee, you have immense freedom, but can help influence policy.
Can I just ask you about your lockdown, because you were shielding for months. How was that, and how did you view the debate around shielding the vulnerable, herd immunity, how everybody else could get on with their lives if just people like you stayed at home?
Well, the first lockdown, so you get the letter, you started getting texts all the time. So, of course, you get a little bit, not nervous, but I wouldn't say it puts the fear of God into you, but you think, oh, God, right. So I stayed at home. Amazingly, I have a chairlift in my house, but having worked for 10 years perfectly, the second or third day of the lockdown, it broke. And of course, it's very old. The company that made it had gone out of existence. So the wonderful person in Essex who tried to fix it took many weeks to get the parts and so on. So I learned to walk up the stairs. And it's the best thing that ever happened to me, because I now walk up the stairs and I hardly ever use the chairlift at all. And I try to do exercise every every day. So in some ways, I've been very lucky. I've got a room to work in. I'm doing this interview in a little office. And because as a child, I spent quite a lot of time by myself, having operations, being at home. It's not been perhaps as hard for me as other people.
What did you think of the way Parliament was sort of forced back, and having got this sort of way of working and remote voting up and running, a lot of it was then sort of scaled back?
So I never understood what the resistance was to participating online and voting. That now has been changed, and I did complain about it big time publicly. Again, it shows how you can actually influence policy, because I couldn't understand. Initially, they were saying you couldn't even have a proxy vote if you were at home. And I thought that was unacceptable. So I did a small campaign on it, and it got changed. And now you can participate in debate. I did go back in Parliament. I loved being there. I don't want to be at home in September, October, November.
Did you speak to Jacob Rees-Mogg about it?
I did. And he's an arts traditionalist. I like him, actually. He is contrary to what people think, he's actually a very nice and decent man, but he's just an arch traditionalist. And the traditionalists, what they were worried about was that this means Parliament is over. We're going to move to electronic voting. Once you open Pandora's box, basically. That's what their argument was. I just see it as ensuring that we can do our jobs properly.
The big question now for the next sort of year or two is to what extent the coronavirus measures and dealing with the pandemic and the economic impact of it has knocked off course all of those things that you talked earlier about wanting to do in terms of addressing poorer communities and opportunity and education for those people who voted Conservative last time. Well, how do you think it can be kept on track?
Well, I think it's going to take a long time to recover, because it's going to be like having to rebuild our infrastructure. We talked about mental health with children. I think there's going to be huge problems with mental health, and the government are going to have to put in a lot of resources into mental health. I think it's going to be enormously difficult. I think it will probably take a year to recover from this once we're out of it, once people have been vaccinated. We don't know whether the economy is going to recover. Well, they say that lots of people have been saving, but on the other side of it, people are, I see it in my constituency, people struggling, people on low incomes, out of work, people being laid off, people losing their hospitality jobs.
And do you think this Chancellor, instinctively wants to, he does talk about sort of getting the public's finances back on track. And the only way you can do that is by raising taxes or cutting spending. Can you do this without hurting more people?
I think actually this is where I am quite conservative, is that I do believe in cutting taxes for business, because I genuinely believe that it brings in more money, and also businesses can invest and employ more. But what I'd like to do, if that is true, what I've just said, is I'd like the government to put the money raised from business in a special redistribution fund, and actually call it that, and use that money to redistribute to poorer communities and to cut the cost of living for the lower paid. And they should put on the Treasury website how that redistribution fund is being spent, so that people can actually see that the reason why they've cut taxes for business, I'm talking about small business particularly, you certainly have to make a level playing field for the huge multinationals, but they need to show that this money, the reason why they've cut that tax money is so that they can raise more money for the revenue, but also get more money to poorer communities.
Well, so you think cutting business taxes would raise more money for the extent?
I do, yes. That's where I'm quite conservative, because I believe that if businesses have to pay less tax, by the way, I'm not talking about the hedge funds and the multi-million, billionaires. What I'm talking about is most businesses in the country, because if you cut taxes, it means these businesses are able to employ more people. The job market is going to be incredibly important to try and get people back into work, and they invest in capital as well. And then employ more people, invest in capital, you generate more revenue for the exchequer. So all I'm saying is that money raised for business should be put in a redistribution fund to be spent on poorer communities and to cut the cost of living for those on lower incomes.
I just want to finally talk briefly, if we can, about Israel and being Jewish, because this is obviously another big area of your life in terms of what you do. You chair. Is it the Conservative Friends of Israel, or what's the organisation?
No, I'm not chair. I'm a member.
You're a member.
Of Conservative Israel. Yes. So, but of course, I support the state of Israel. One, because it's proud to be British. As I say, I've been born here. My father was an immigrant here. My mother's side had been here for a long, long time. But I think the state of Israel is a place where, as the saying goes, one, it's a place where people went because of the Holocaust. I think it's right that the Jewish people can have a nation that they call their own. It's smaller than the size of Wales. I think that they have done some incredible things. If you just look at the vaccination program going on at the moment. And I think that they have a right to have a state and have the security that goes on along with that having a state.
And do you feel that you've been discriminated against at all because you're Jewish?
Very rarely. I found that England seems to be divided into either two groups, either Philo-Semites or anti-Semites. And so many people actually admire and love people who are from a Jewish background. And anti-Semitism is pretty low compared to what you see in other countries. And we're very lucky.
Do you think overall, when you look back, that you've had a rather charmed life? I mean, when you talk about it, you don't seem to have been picked on over disability. You don't seem to have been discriminated against over your ethnicity and religious background. You went to Parliament as a small boy and decided you wanted to be an MP, and you've become one. It's an extraordinary story, really, isn't it?
Well, I've been very lucky. I've struggled with my legs. As I mentioned, when you wake up in the morning and you might have aggro or whatever every day. But I've been very lucky. But I wasn't handed an MP on a plate. I didn't have any connections. I had to fight. I fought 2 elections before I got there. I lost one by literally 97 votes in 2005. And no one's handed anything to me. I've done it myself. But without a doubt, I've been very lucky. But I try and, in a small way, try and make a difference to peoples and communities in my community in Harlow and in my job as a parliamentarian.
And if you could change the world in any way, just waving a magic wand, what would you do?
I'd like to change our system that every single young person will be 100% guaranteed to do an apprenticeship, right from level 2 up to degree level, and that 50% of students would be doing degree apprenticeships. So they'd earn while they learn, no debt, get a skill and a job at the end.
Robert Halfon, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.